Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And Steve, it's brilliant to have you here. So to start with, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alan. Delighted to be here. I'm Steve Schecter. I am founder of Much Smarter, a company that teaches young people how to develop successful habits of thinking, feeling, and learning. I've been doing this happily for 20 years and consider myself fortunate to be playing a game that I've chosen and a game that I love.
Thanks, Steve. And tell me, I'm curious because 20 years, that's quite some time you've been working in this area. But it feels to me as though there's a shift happening right now. And I'm just wondering whether that's reflected in the level of interest in your work.
That's a fantastic question. I think that in some ways, my work has gotten easier because when I first articulated the idea that our success and well-being are a function of how we think, how we feel, and how we learn, it drew a blank with many prospective clients. They said, why don't you just teach Johnny how to ace his exams and let's get on with it. But I find that the vast majority of prospective clients that I speak with are profoundly interested in our message and in our method. And even those who come to us with the plea, please help Johnny be more successful in his exams, are really aware of the fact that if they in fact want that, the way that I'm going to show them is probably the best possible way for him to approach that whole issue. And so,
Yeah.
so that's been the big shift. The big shift for us also is being a mindful entrepreneur. I've shifted from doing the work myself to creating something that can do the work for me and thereby reach many more people. So in 2018, we began to shift our focus from private practice to learning games that enable us to do two things. Number one, reach more people. And number two, and maybe this is even the bigger thing, to reach people who would not find our private practice accessible.
Okay.
And that's a very, our team is, I think, motivated at least as much by social equity as they are by education and educational outcomes, if you will. So there's a bit of a subtext that we'd love it for every child to have the kind of advantage that formerly got offered only by a fancy private school education. That's really what animates us.
Yeah. And if people are listening to this now and thinking, oh, this sounds interesting, I'd like to know more, where do they go?
Actually, quite easily, www.muchsmarter.com. That's our.
Muchsmarter.com. Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. So I've got the ValuesJam card deck here, and we're going to choose a card. So let me just tip out some in front of me. And how many piles would you like me to make?
Well, I think, the Trinity. Make three.
Okay, let's do that. And they're all different sizes. So would you like left, right, or center?
Let's go for the center.
Center. Okay, so I've got 4 cards here. So number between 1 and 4.
Three.
3. Okay. So this is the card we're going to deal with. Creativity, Steve. So I hope you're pleased with your choice. And the first question is this: what does creativity mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like for you?
What an awesome question, Alan. Thank you for that. Well, since you're all about values, I would say creativity ranks at or near the top value for me. And I think creativity I guess to look at the word creativity, I think it means being able to design one's life. I think that's primarily what it is. I think fundamentally, I'm here to create something. So given my choices of what to do with my time here, I'm here to create something. And so creativity, I know it's a circular, I'm giving you a circular definition, but creativity for me surely implies being able to create something. And I guess as I get into the word a little bit, it becomes even more profound than that, because I learned when I left the safety of the corporate environment, or I should probably say the apparent safety of the corporate environment. When I left that environment, the fundamental thing I learned was that entrepreneurship is about taking intangible thought and harnessing the energy and forces around you to turn that intangible thought into tangible reality. And that's not my definition for creativity. That's the definition that Napoleon Hill might have for creativity. But I will, kind of having meandered around the word for about a few minutes, I'll kind of land there, being able to take the intangible, and turn it into something tangible. There would be a definition I'd be happy with.
Great. And I loved listening to the process that you went through there, from seeing and hearing the word in the first instance, and then kind of feeling into it and working around it, and then landing where you did. That was great. And there are a couple of things that you've mentioned. So the first one is this thing around choices, because we do, don't we? We have choices. We can choose where we invest our time and energy and creativity. And so it's not as if this is something that is only for particular people. We all have the opportunity to do this if we want to. So that's the first thing. And then something else, I can't remember what it was that you said that triggered this, but I think of creativity as being sometimes not what you might expect. So when I think of somebody who's creative, I think, oh yeah, well, I wouldn't have thought of that. There's an element of that when I think of creative people. And I'm fascinated. I love the definition that you landed on, actually, and it resonates with me, because one of my personal core values is not creativity, but it's close. So the word I use is creation. And the reason I've chosen that word is because I really enjoy working with other people to create value where there wasn't before, which is kind of close to what you were talking about, right?
Close, quite close.
Yeah. And then what about the metaphor element of the question, Steve? What does, if you think about creativity, what images come to mind? What sounds come to mind? What feelings come to mind?
Yeah, well, the feeling is as close to pure joy as I get. And the sounds that come to mind are, I think, the sounds of perhaps among the greatest music ever written. And I think about, I'm doing a little free associating with you here, Alan, but over the summer, my wife and I traveled up to a place called Tanglewood, which is in Western Massachusetts in the mountains. And it's a glorious place where people come and listen to the Boston Symphony Orchestra play. And most people are sitting out on a beautiful lawn with the mountains in the background. And this year, for the second or third year in a row, we went to see a performance of Ode to Joy, of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, with that incredible, 100-person chorus. So if you ask about sounds, that's what I feel about the joy of creation. And I guess that would also fit the definition of people banding together to create value that wasn't there. When I hear those sounds, even as I remember it, I get close to tears thinking about the joy and the and this feeling of creation and all of these individual souls participating in that joy of creation. So did I leave anything out? I think I talked about visual, and I think I talked about sounds, and I think I talked about feeling. Yeah, it's really it's very uplifting feeling, this idea of creation.
Yeah, you did it. You did it. And so, if I can play back to you, before we started recording, we were talking about our weekends, and I was sharing how I'd been to a street graffiti exhibition or a graffiti art exhibition, and I think probably because I just saw these images yesterday, that's really front of mind for me when I think about creativity, because these works were just so out there, and really bold use of shapes and colors, it was fantastic, really fantastic. Um, and then sound, there is a song track in my, oh, now before I say that, I want to ask you, you said the greatest music ever written. You did talk about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but do you have a favorite track?
I have a few. I actually have some that are I would call them the soundtracks of my life, and they occurred early, and over about a 3-4 year period. Um, I heard Beethoven's Seventh and Beethoven's Fifth, Mozart's 40th, and then Mozart's 27th piano concerto. And then not too long after that, I discovered the Beatles, and those became the soundtracks of my life. They're a little different, but to this day, when I want to recharge and feel like I'm feeling the whole pattern of my life, I can go back to any of those.
Right. Okay. So music for me, and I'm thinking about creativity here because I'm thinking that this might not be the right word, but experimental in terms of music. So I'm thinking Talking Heads, for instance, or
Mhm.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I remember the first time I heard any of their music, I just thought, wow, I've never heard anything like this before. Maybe Pink Floyd would go in that same bracket as well. Um, and feelings, you talked about emotions and tears. And I have to confess, there's a program called The Voice. Do you have that in the US? It's a bit like a talent show.
I'm not familiar with it. I can't say authoritatively whether we have it or not.
Okay. Well, the way that it works basically is that the judges are facing away from the artist,
Mhm.
and so they can only judge the artist on their voice.
Yeah.
Um, and whenever somebody has an amazing voice and really nails a song, I quite often am moved to tears, and I don't really understand why, because it's an appreciation of the talent as much as anything else, I think. But music certainly does have that for me. It's not quite on the topic of creativity, perhaps. Um, and so that's my three. So we talked about the image of the graffiti. We talked about music and various types of music. And then we talked about those deep inner emotions that somehow come out when we're thinking about music. Final example, actually, I associate with being Welsh. My father was from Wales, and one of the best musical experiences I think anybody can have is to listen to the Welsh national anthem being sung at a rugby match or a football match. It's just incredible.
Well, that's an experience I'll seek out now that you've mentioned it. Just by happenstance, how do you feel about Dylan Thomas as a poet? Do you like him?
I don't know his work really closely, obviously under Milkwood. I wouldn't say that I read him a lot, but when I have, how have I felt about his work? I think I think I felt that I'm probably not smart enough to understand it.
Okay. Well, I doubt that, Alan, but I wanted to mention, since we're on the topic of whales, I think he's the author of my favorite poem. It's called Poem in October, and there are two aspects of the poem that I like very much. He gives me a strong feeling of place in that poem. He talks about the sea and the harbor um, and then the other part of the poem. There's a line in the poem which has always been especially meaningful to me as a creator. Um, the poem is the line is the final line of the poem is, "Oh, may my heart's truth still be sung on this high hill in a year's turning." And so I think there's something really beautiful about that. And it relates to the thought that we had before about me still connecting deeply with the music I first heard as a child. And I feel like there's something really fulfilling about when the great values of your life endure and the great themes of your life endure and actually get amplified. It's a joy you can't have when you're 20, right? It's a truly beautiful thing.
Yeah, Steve, you are giving me the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up right now, and the reason why is this: um, I'm involved with a global poetry showcase. So we started it 3 years ago, and it's focused on the topic of values. This year, an additional initiative is that every day during the month of October, in celebration of World Values Day, that is on the 19th of October, Global Poetry Showcase is sharing a single poem on LinkedIn for 31 days. And a poem in October
Oh,
just
wow.
and the
Wow.
way that you described the last line makes it absolutely relevant. So I was just working on the next batch from the 15th of October this morning, and I'm going to add this poem from Dylan Thomas in to that as a concrete outcome of this wonderful conversation that we're having.
I've got the goosebumps also. That's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing.
Okay, now this is not a question from the back of the cards, but it's because you mentioned something earlier about how you're very methodical. And this is making me curious about the combination of methodical and creative, because perhaps some people that are listening to this think of creativity as being more spontaneous and off the cuff. But you are a creative person. You're an entrepreneur. You're a musician. So how do the two go together for you?
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you mentioned how do they go together for you, because I do think there are different paths, um, and I have a particular one that I've learned that's worked for me very well. I don't expect it necessarily to work for everybody. However, I do think there's something that most can learn from it. So let me describe the process of where I discovered the heart of creativity for me. I found myself very young, both a natural and, I want to say, without bragging, a precocious musician. So, in other words, without going into detail, um, I did things early that I can't figure out how I did. Okay, so I knew that, and yet um, there was always something missing. There were two important things missing, but there was always a sense of being an undeveloped natural talent, and I didn't see it until I found a very important piano teacher in my life. And this piano teacher taught me how to approach difficulty. And it's animated not only my music, but it's animated my approach to business, and it's animated how I teach students. So she taught me fundamentally how to break difficulty down, how to approach a very challenging musical piece as music. In other words, how to approach even the drills as music. And so it was investing some love in every drill, in every practice. You know, some of the scientists talk about flow. So she taught me how to get into a flow state even when I was doing scales. And then to methodically break down a difficult piece into small, workable parts so that whatever I was practicing on a given day was just a little north of what I could do comfortably, not difficult. And to patiently and methodically put the thing back together, where after a period of time, lovingly and patiently working on it, it became totally effortless. And I have to tell you, that experience of starting with the difficult and ending up effortless was a real joy. And it became almost a pattern. It became how I wanted to approach everything. So I had a rock band. That rock band was the best drilled rock band in New York, second to none. This became an MO, if you will. But then I discovered something else, that as a songwriter, I was subject to the usual limits of creativity. In other words, writer's block, feeling occasionally creative and spontaneous. And then I discovered from this notion of developing talent rather than relying on talent, I discovered that if I simply, and I didn't discover this until later when I decided to work on a musical, but I discovered if I would show up at the piano at a set time every day and pick a theme almost randomly, if I picked the theme, then the creativity would start to flow more often. So there was the link between spontaneity and joy and all those intangibles and creativity, that if you adopt it's like the meeting place of the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain. In the Greek philosophers, the meeting place between Dionysian and Apollonian.
Yeah.
So that was the sweet spot. And I found that if I showed up at 9 o'clock every night at the piano, 9 to 11 every night, that my musical got written. And I would just show up and I'd play the whole musical every night. So here was what happened, is that showing up every night started to trigger ideas with more regularity. They would just come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And then I discovered in my private tutoring practice that it even started to show up in relationship to something intellectual like math. Now, I had no natural talent for math, but I found that by showing up enough, that the brain starts to get, it's almost like, if you think about what an author does, an author starts to build up a collection of words and phrases and sentences and ideas, and from a richness of pattern, creativity starts to emerge out of a stored richness of pattern. And I think that's where the two meet. I know that may be more of an answer than you were looking for, but I have a lot to say about it.
It's fascinating, and it makes me wonder about isn't the brain a wonderful thing?
Oh my, yeah.
You know, we still don't understand very much of it, I guess. But I'm thinking, you know, what was your brain there during the day having a chat with itself, saying, we better be ready for 9 o'clock because Steve's going to be wanting to write his musical, so come on.
Well, I think you're right, Alan. I think there is that kind of thing that goes on. I think there is a mystery to it, and I don't, without having any anticipation of being able to confirm this experimentally, I do believe there's a bit of mystery to it in terms of a connection to a larger intelligence than our own. Paul McCartney once said that he felt that when he and John Lennon were doing their best work, he said he felt like their ideas were coming from the spheres. That was the word he used. So they too had a process. They would show up and they'd kind of bounce things back and forth at each other, and they had a process, and then certain magic happens. But so I think it's both our own brain, and I think it's in some mysterious way, which maybe we'll never understand. It's, I think, some connection with the quantum.
Yeah. You've reminded me of somebody that you might know, but if you don't know, you might want to look up a guy called Dr. Jeff Mims. So he's a music psychologist, and he's done some really fascinating research into a musician's state when they're in the pocket. Is that the term, in the pocket? Yeah. So I thought I remembered it right. And so I'll send you a link afterwards if you want to look him up. He's a great guy. Okay, so let's move on to another question, Steve. And we've talked a lot about creativity and we've touched on various areas. So let's go in a different direction. And let me ask you, where have you noticed a lack of creativity?
Oh, that's so interesting. I think in environments that are maybe excessively authoritarian, then it becomes individuals who can otherwise be creative. And I think probably all of us have within us the ability or the latent ability to be creative. But I think in environments where truth is received from above, I think you see a lack of creativity.
Mm.
It gets either beaten or scared out of people.
That's a great point. It's very different. So the what came to mind for me is busy environments.
Ah,
So, when people haven't got that space or the breath to be able to take, to be able to reconsider, they're just so overly busy with executing tasks that there is no creativity. And it's also so a client of mine at the moment, one of their values is creativity. And the last time we spoke, we were talking about the importance of creating the environment which is conducive to creativity, because you can't just demand it. You've got to provide the space, the conditions, the encouragement for it to happen, right? It won't just happen on its own.
I think that's a very powerful point, Alan. Yeah, the other phrase that came back to me, if I can think of times when I've been unable to be creative, I think about three words: trying too hard. It's not something you can, it's something you can nurture, but it's not something you can control.
Yeah, yeah. And you're also making me think now about not only musicians who we've talked about, but also sports people. So I'm thinking of, say, a top level tennis player who undertakes practice, which is very methodical. It would be 2 hours of cross court forehand. That's what I'm going to spend my time on. And a bit like you were talking about with your music teacher, the game is broken down into those really small parts, practiced intensely.
Right.
But then when the sports person is complete, they have the whole range available to them. And that's when you see the most amazing shots that you think, how on earth did they manage to do that? And sometimes when they're interviewed, they can't answer the question because they've been equipped, but it's not really a conscious process. It's more of a reaction from somewhere.
Yeah. And the way to shut that down is by trying to control it.
Yeah.
Because it's coming from somewhere, and our conscious mind is not capable of it. So our conscious mind is great at setting up the process, at designing the process. But I had a wonderful experience with this very piano teacher, where I was a little afraid, because I had what sparked me to find this piano teacher was that I had under-planned, under-prepared for a concert prior to meeting her, and failed. I wound up freezing on stage, and gracefully bowing off. I stood up, smiled, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize, but I'm unable to continue. Thank you so much," and walked off. And but I was concerned about it happening again, and so I was over efforting towards the end of this preparation with this wonderful teacher. I had the entire thing. I mean, I knew what I knew so well that 5 years later I could play it. But the morning of the concert, I began to try to force it. I went to the practice room and tried to play and couldn't. And then I had a first experience of just saying, I'm just going to let it go. I just let it go. And I think it was so. If you were asking, when does creativity not happen, it's when you try to control it, when you try to tell each of 500 muscles how to respond if you're a tennis player, or
Yeah.
when as a mathematician you try to tell which of your nerve cells to deliver the impulses that give you the right answer. It's those kinds of things. So we actually, and much smarter, we teach 10 habits of thinking, 10 habits of feeling, and 10 habits of learning. And thinking habit number 4 is, and I express the thinking habits in the form of a mantra or an affirmation. So thinking habit number 4 is, I make it happen and I let it happen. And then when a student says, well, what does that mean? Or when I ask a student to tell me what it means, what the student will say is, all right, well, I make it happen by showing up for practice, and I let it happen by relying on the practice to deliver for me.
Oh, I love that. How do you encourage your students to use those, Steve? Because and the reason I'm asking the question is because 3 times 10 is 30. And I use something called the 31 practices.
Right. Well, that's an evolving question, Alan. And as I said to you in the beginning of our practice, we were offering it up and getting differential results. In other words, people knew they liked us for some reason, but they couldn't tell us why.
Right.
But now what I'm actually doing is I'm engaging the student in reflecting on the habit, reflecting on how they might apply it to their chosen game, which is whatever the game is they've asked us to help them with, and ask them to relate how that habit might apply to other games they're involved in. So typically, a student might find herself a gymnastic person or a dancer, and so or a martial artist, and so they've got the habit which they may be contemplating for the first time, and they can think about how it applies to this game they're trying to learn, and they're thinking about analogous experiences in trying to master dance. And so they have a holistic inner and outer application of the thinking habit. So Alan, that's how we do it today. But the full answer to your question, let's turn the page and see. This is where we're going with Much Smarter, is to continue to think about how we can best help students learn how to think, feel, and learn successfully. And I've actually just decided, by the way, to use the word successful. I've been shy about the word successful in recent years because people, I think, people feel it's a pressure word. So I'm going to both use the word successful and clarify that I don't confuse success with monetary success. So in other words, I feel it's, for me, successful means, coming back to the word create, successful means being able to design one's life. And if that life is to be an ascetic in India, that's successful.
Yeah.
So yeah, so but it's an evolving question, and it's probably the most exciting part of what we're doing is to look to turn the page on and to see how we can deepen and broaden that.
Mm. And I love how you defined what you meant by successful, because I too am very wary of both the word success and the word failure, because I think they're emotionally laden and there's a lot of risk attached to even the use of them, because
Right.
often it's somebody's particular perspective, and who's to say that perspective is valid or not. So I think that as with many values words, actually, the definition is what's far more important than the label that's used. Um, and then just in terms of your turning of the page, maybe I just give you, it's an idea, not a suggestion. So it might spark different ideas, but the way that the 31 practices approach works is through conscious daily practice. And I just wonder whether, if I was one of your students and I had your 3 times 10 habits, if I would feel benefit and value in consciously practicing one of those every single day over a period of time, in order that the habit would then become embedded.
I think that's a strongly probable yes, Alan. I think that's a strongly probable yes. Yeah. I think that conscious daily practice is a big thing. And perhaps just one at a time. You know, it's I find that consciously trying to apply 30 at a time uh, is hard for the conscious mind anyway. I think the non-conscious can handle that brilliantly, but conscious, yeah, would be methodical, one at a time.
Yeah, and the way that it was described to me by, this was in a work setting, but a lady in South Africa who was a call center operator. She said, "Do you know, when I come in the morning to work and I know that I'm going to be really busy, I look at the practice for the day, and it just anchors me. It sets me up for the day. And I know that I'm going to have lots of things on. But if, for instance, the practice for today is to um, build a relationship with somebody new, then I know that I'm going to do that, and it's very easy for me to do it. And by the end of the day, I know whether I've done it or not. So it's a really great way for me to set myself up. Um, Okay. So in ValuesJam, Steve, there's also an opportunity to create our own question. So I'm going to invite you to do this. Ask your own question about creativity, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how.
So ask a question of you,
Of us, and we'll both,
us.
yeah.
Okay, so let's reference a third party. Um, who is someone that strikes you as enormously creative? Someone other than you or me?
Okay. So the names that are popping into my head first and foremost are Picasso and David Bowie.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So why? I think Picasso, it's my perception, and I'm not really knowledgeable in the area of art, but it's, whenever I saw his work, it was, whoa, that's different. And that's the only reason that I mention him. And David Bowie, it's partly personal fondness, I think, because I just love and loved his music all the way through. But then when I think about his different personae as he went through his life and the different stages of his life, even right up until his death, actually, and for somebody to be creative to that extreme strikes me as being totally admirable.
Yeah, I love the theme and I love the different colors and shades that you and I choose. So in other words, when you talked about Pink Floyd, you talked about Picasso. I have a feeling that I'd be talking about Michelangelo or Raphael, and and you're talking about Pink Floyd, and I'm talking really about the Beatles, and it's almost like you're a bit edgier than I am. Uh, you know what I mean? It's just a little more, just a little more, maybe a little more playful, a little more out there. And those are my own words. And I think I just love the recurring choices that we're making. Mine is a little more, a little more.
Sophisticated, Steve.
Oh no, I wasn't thinking that. I was thinking more, more classical. Is
Yeah,
really
yeah,
just more classical, because even the Beatles. What did I? At first, at first I was a little put off by rock and roll, but then when uh, when I came across songs like Yesterday and uh, and Eleanor Rigby, and I felt, well, I could be at home at this stuff, but I have classical tastes, to this day, when the pandemic hit, my wife and I were looking for something to fill up our lives since we weren't going out much anymore. What did we do? My wife has a doctorate in education, and so she said, "But I never had a liberal arts degree. Can we read together?" So we began reading together. But what did I choose to read? Classical novels, Charles Dickens,
yeah,
Tolstoy.
yeah,
So I'm enjoying the. I mean, this isn't values. This is just the difference in tastes, things that appeal to us.
yeah. And I'm glad you're enjoying it because that's one of the things about ValuesJam, I think, that everybody just loves because there's no pressure to defend. It's not like this is right and that is wrong or anything like that. It's just a beautiful exploration between us, and difference adds so much in that context, right? So when you ask the question about who strikes you as being really creative, what was your thinking there?
Well, I was actually back to my friends Lennon and McCartney, uh,
Okay.
and the thing that there was a period of time when each new thing they did was truly an adventure, and I loved the musicians that followed them, but the musicians that followed them were truly musicians that followed them. In other words, that the an album like Sergeant Pepper, where everything was just so not done before. I just thought that was enormously creative. I guess so. Creativity then has an element of boldness in it. So believe it or not, I was thinking when I was answering the question for myself, I was thinking about the Beatles, and then I jumped to Stephen Jobs with what I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing his name the right way, but I thought about the iPad, and I
Yeah.
thought about how bold that was, and how um, he was just willing to take it in a totally take things in a totally different direction, and it sort of almost like makes you gasp at how he was willing to take that leap and say, okay, here it is.
Yeah, and you're making me think also about how creativity is not necessarily determined by the level of acceptance that it receives, because there will be the equivalents of the iPad that nobody's heard of that just bombed.
Right.
But were they any less creative? I'm not sure, actually. And that's one of the things that I love about creativity. And if we think about music, I sometimes wonder, you know, who's to say what is better, whether it's Justin Timberlake or if there's a band out of New Zealand that I really like called Fat Freddy's Drop. You know, who's to say which is better, even though the one sells millions and millions of albums and the other has maybe a smaller fan base? Who says which is better?
I am really in agreement with that, and I think that um, ultimately embracing that is very powerful. When I studied the Beatles, and I studied them for quite some time, I recognized in John Lennon somebody that could just as easily have ended up on the street someplace. I mean, in other words, he was willing to be who he was,
Yeah.
and and um, and so I think there's great power in that. And so, you know, even when I shared with you before about my realization that I'd like to use the word success, it's not because I believe that will appeal to everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but I realize it's a word that gives me energy.
Yeah.
And the reason why it gives me energy comes back to our theme today. I'm choosing to make creativity and creation one of the values in my life. And so, to the extent that I can devote myself to creating something, I can be successful in that, even in just the devotion. So, successful is a word that resonates with me, and I'm okay with it resonating with the prospective clients and viewers with whom that resonates.
Yeah.
In other words, if the word success turns you off, I won't take it personally,
Yeah.
and I won't judge you for it either.
Yeah.
Right? What I think the beauty of our existence here, um, is fraught with all the perils that this time has. But I'm convinced every time has its perils. I think one of the beauties about our time is that we get to choose. We get to create our own life. We get to create our own little universe.
Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful way to start to wrap this Values Jam session up, Steve, with that picture of us as a success being able to create our own lives in the way that we wish. So there's a final question that I have for you, and that is, what are you encouraged to do differently about creativity as a result of our conversation?
What a wonderful question. Well, I think the conscious daily practice is my big takeaway from today. That's a power principle, and love that. And I think it goes back to what the thread of the conversation. Where does discipline and creativity meet? It's in the application of conscious daily practice. So there's the three words. The three words. The big uplift I got from today was the three words: conscious daily practice.
Okay, and if I might ask, what are you encouraged to do with those three words then?
Well, I'm encouraged to fold them into the organic evolution of our 30 habits, our 10 thinking, 10 feeling, and 10 learning habits, and beginning to lovingly contemplate how we're going to use that, um, going forward with the students that enter our, if you will, our academy.
Okay. And then, so just to give you a little bit more information about the parallel with 31 practices in case it's of interest. So um, it operates on a daily basis, right? So there's no more than 31 days in a month. That's why it's 31 practices.
Of course.
But there are not so many months with 31 days. There are many more months with 30. And so the 31st practice I usually recommend is I choose my favorite practice and practice. So in your case, what you might encourage your students to do is just choose one of the 30 today on the 31st and then just practice that one. And then the rest of the 30 can be present apart from in the month of February, of course. Yeah. And then in terms of my takeaway from today, what am I encouraged to do differently? I'm going to introduce Jeff Mims to you so that you can check him out. And if you'd like to be introduced, then I can set that up. And then the poem in October by Dylan Thomas is definitely going to go into the set of poems for October for the Global Poetry Showcase. So I feel great that something really tangible has come out of this conversation for me, in addition to having really enjoyed the ride.
I've really enjoyed the ride as well. Just brilliant, Alan. I actually I actually want to say that it's really what I expected. I just knew this was going to be a great call.
Thank you, Steve. Cheers.
Cheers.